I want my kids, my daughter to like be comfortable with technology. I want her to like see the beauty of it. I love the idea of exposing her to like some of the tinkering that I do and like the magic that technology can bring, I think sometimes. But I'm also like a big fan of like the outdoors. My hope is that like she can like find this like sort of genuine sort of passion for like the beauty of the outdoors and like finding this as kind of like a quiet place that recharges you and connect this to like, the power of technology, I guess, in a way.
Welcome to Startup Dad, the podcast where we dive deep into the lives of dads who are also leaders in the world of startups and business. I'm your host, Adam Fishman. In today's episode, I sat down with my longtime friend and former colleague, Ben Lauzier. Ben is the co-founder and CEO of Nurra, an AI-powered health assistant that helps you navigate your healthcare and gives you a health advocate for your complex needs. Prior to that, Ben was the VP of product at Thumbtack and a longtime product leader at Lyft, where we first met. In addition to being an incredible founder, he's also a husband and the father of a young daughter. In our conversation today, we spoke about the health challenges that caused Ben to lean in more to fatherhood and eventually start his own company. We also talked about the differences in parenting between France and the US and what it has been like to start a company with a 2-year-old. He had some great advice for dads on how to balance self-care with fatherhood and remembering that change is the only constant in parenting. As a person immersed with technology and tinkering, we also talked about what he hopes for the future of technology with his daughter. I hope you enjoy today's conversation with Ben Lauzier. I would like to welcome my friend Ben Lauzier to the Startup Dad podcast. Ben, been a long time coming to get you on this show. I'm very excited to have you here. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me. I've also been eagerly waiting for my time on this podcast. So a dream come true.
It's your moment in the sun. Lenny, yes. Step aside. Startup Dad is here. So Ben, tell me a bit about your professional journey.
So I'm French originally, but spent my entire career in the US. I did part of my master's at Northeastern in Boston. And after that, got a job in New York. And my wife actually got a job at Dropbox in the Bay Area. I think this was 2010, I think. And we moved to the Bay Area right after that. I got a job. I was employee number 3 at a small startup called Cater to Me, a marketplace for corporate catering, restaurants, food trucks, and companies. And so I was employee number 3, leading growth basically, and scaled the company for about a year and a half. And Lyft was one of our clients, and this is how we got to meet actually. And so I think we had some kind of referral program or something like that. And I think he messaged me, oh, that's a cool program. We should chat. And I could not resist the Adam Fishman charm, I think. And I got completely swayed, and the rest is history. Joined Lyft with you after and stayed at Lyft for 6 years, I think, from 2013 to 2019, I think, until the IPO. And during most of my time at Lyft, I was basically leading the supply side of product. So all the teams touching drivers, the driver onboarding team, the experience team, a lot of the compliance team and all that stuff. So a lot of really, really exciting challenges there, as you know. And after Lyft, I realized that I just loved marketplaces way too much. I love the depth that they add to the products that we build. And so I joined Thumbtack, a home services marketplace. And I joined as the VP of product and growth, basically, and worked on a lot of really cool things, bringing a lot of the learnings from Lyft on how do you pivot the marketplace to do the business to be much more marketplace centric, and got a lot of really exciting sort of challenges on the heels of that. But 3 years ago, I'm sure we'll sort of talk a lot more about my personal journey, but just to wrap up on the professional side, I guess 3 years ago, my wife had a set of, health challenges that were really complicated to manage. And so and at the same time, to make things easy, we also had a baby. And so I basically had to quit my job to be a caretaker for my wife and our daughter and focused on doing more consulting, advising. I was also an executive in residence at Reforge for a bit. I think that you're also intimately familiar with. Every couple of years, we turn path again. Yeah, and moved to France about a year ago, actually, to be a little closer to family while my wife sort of recovers. We're still thinking about a move back to the US once everything settles. And since then, got obsessed with some of the healthcare issues that, we got a glimpse of when we were in the US. and built a health advocacy platform called Nurra. And this is like what I've been working on for like the past 2 months is basically like scaling this, my own startup, I guess, from the French ops, but tackling the US healthcare system.
Wow. Amazing. What a journey. We're going to talk more about Nurra in a bit because I think that's a really relevant personal story. And so I did want to go back in time though and just ask you, so obviously you are French, not a stretch. Can't hide the accent from me, Ben.
I told you. It's not, yeah.
It's definitely the microphone. You found the French accent microphone. I am very curious about what life was like growing up for you. So where did you grow up? Where in France did you grow up? You have one sister, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. Oh my God.
Yeah. Just tell me a little bit about life growing up in France.
Yeah. I grew up in a really like rural part of France, in the south of France. My dad was actually a pilot in the French Air Force. And it's like we would like move every like year and a half, every 2 years, because he'd be like stationed at like a different like base. So we got to like travel a little bit across France, but then I spent the bulk of my childhood in the south of France. And yeah, just like a very small like town, like 500 people. Actually, the town that my dad was born in and like that my grandfather was born in. So there's like a lot of like cultural identity that was attached to this. And yeah, like spent a lot of my childhood just living in the outdoors of like French countryside, I guess.
Yeah. When you walked around this town of 500 people, were they like, oh, that's whatever your dad's name. That's it. That's his kid. I know exactly. Him. He's from here. Yeah.
I was a legend. Like people would like ask to take photos of me. Yeah, I was.
You were the mayor of the 500 person town in the south of France. That's awesome. And you do have you've younger sister, right?
Yes,
younger sister.
I have one younger sister.
She's in France. Still?
She's in France. She's in Annecy, which is where I am at. I'm in the French Alps right now, about half an hour from Geneva, an hour from Chamonix. That's where she is. This was like a big part of the appeal with this area is we lived in Tahoe for a bit and absolutely love like the mountains and the lake. And so this is kind of the French Tahoe, I guess, in a way.
Yes. French Tahoe. Let's keep that a secret. We don't want it to be overrun by tourists. So you have a wife, Gail, and you have a daughter, Noah, right? And how did you and your wife meet each other?
Ooh. So we've been together for, I think she's going to kill me if I don't remember this, but I think we've been together for 20 years now. And I'm 36. So we've been together for since high school, basically. Yeah. So we met in high school in France, and somehow we actually traveled quite a bit together. We lived in, we did the same business school, and then we did our like internships in like Australia, in Ireland, in Boston, and like throughout like all this, we like managed to kind of stick together. So,
wow. And so is she from that same tiny town that you grew up in?
She's not my cousin, Adam, if that's what you're implying.
No. This is France, not the United States, man. So
she's from a neighboring town.
Okay. Got it. Yeah, we'll allow it. And then your daughter is 2.5. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Oh, terrible twos. Very fun. We will get into that shortly. What was the decision like for you and your wife to start a family?
I feel like moving to the US felt like very precarious. Like our entire lives like felt incredibly precarious. I think like my wife came in at some point on like a tourist visa. She knew she had like 30 days to find a job, and like it was just incredibly stressful. Then you're in this like constant stream of like J1 visas, which are like 18 months visas that you have to like figure shit out as you go. And so you can never like stay for too long. Then you get like the immediate, like the slightly longer version of this with an H1B visa, which is like maybe like 3 to 4 years. And so like I think for most of our adult life, we felt this like sort of constant state of like, precarity in a way. And we never felt like we could like really settle in one place and like build a family. It took us like, I think we'd been together for 10 years before like I proposed and like we got married, just because, it just felt like there was just so much going on, I guess, for us. And I think we're at this point where we're like, okay, like we had a green card. And so like this felt stable. We had bought a house. And now like, okay, like, wow, for the first time in our life, there's like a semblance of like stability, like this financial stability. We can like actually project ourselves out like, sort of 5 years into the horizon. And so naturally the question of like, having kids like came on the heels of that.
Yeah. And I forget, there was a point where you lived like a few blocks away from me. Was that the first house you bought? I can't remember if you were renting that house or you bought it. Yes.
Yeah.
I remember we had you over for a very French wine and cheese evening in the backyard. It was lovely. Yep. It was lovely. So I wanted to ask you, about your earliest memory that you have after becoming a dad. So tell me a little bit about that.
For me, the most like sort of like vivid memory that I have is like being in the hospital, like during the entire pregnancy. I told my wife, like, look, you're doing all the hard work. Like the moment the baby's born, like I'm going to pull my weight. I promise. Like I'll do everything I can. Like, don't worry. Like this is the one thing that I can't really like help you with. But the moment the baby is here, like I promise I'll pull my weight. I'll be there for you. And then the baby came and I was like, oh my God, and my wife, had like all the sort of the stress and, all this stuff, like the delivery. And I think the first night was okay, but the second night like was, crying, like all night as, they tend to do at this age. And so I was like in the bathroom, like of the hospital room, like sort of, like holding her in my arms and be like, oh my God, it begins. Like, this is like what pulling my weight looks like. When my wife is sleeping, I'm sitting in the shower, like with this baby. That feels terrifying. So this is the most vivid memory that I have because it was this sort of realization of, what I'd signed up for, but also this like, amazement for like what's happening in this moment.
Yeah. And Noah was born in the US, right? Because you didn't move to France until about a year ago. Yeah. Okay, great. All right. So I want to get into Nurra a little bit. So you started Nurra based on personal experience that you mentioned earlier related to healthcare and sort of navigating care and your wife. And I remember learning about this, and this, you mentioned earlier that you kind of had to take a step back from professional life for a little bit. So I imagine that this experience, not starting Nurra, but the experience of navigating the healthcare system really changed you both professionally and probably as a dad too. So tell me a little bit more about that.
My wife decided to have she had like a long string of like really challenging like health issues. And I think over like sort of the course of a couple of years, I think it gave me like a very different perspective on like sort of my career and like, the what my priorities like should be, I think, in life. And so I think this was like the first sort of like realization, like that I had was just like the importance of, like family and health and the things you take for granted, I think. And I think so she like, just to touch briefly on like sort of some of the challenges that she experienced, like, we would wait for like 3, 4, 5, 6 months for an appointment with a specialist. And she would have like, in some cases, 6 minutes with the provider. So like you have like 100 seconds of talking time in this moment. And you come back, you have all those questions like, oh my God, this doctor told us the opposite of this other doctor. Like, what do we do? And it's so hard when like, if you're working at like a tech company, like you're doing like 50 hours a week or 60 hours a week, and you're like, you have zero like mental capacity to like, be like, oh, let's, be a thought partner. Let's bounce off ideas and like what it could be. You realize that you need to create like extra capacity, I think, for a lot of this thing. And this is like particularly true when we had a baby. And so like, like we had this baby and we were like trying to take care of this baby, then realizing like, wow, like we need to make space in our life, I think, for to answer like some of those questions. So yeah, I became my wife's sort of like health advocate and like, care coordinator in a way. And this sort of like helped me recenter on like both, what are the right priorities for me? And it was like, I want to care for like my wife and my daughter. This is like what my priorities should be. And my second priority was like, I want like more people to have like, the type of help that like my wife shouldn't have to like ask for. Like this should be like a given. You deserve like someone that fights for you in the healthcare systems. Like all the time that, I can free up, I should dedicate it to like, building, a solution at scale that, helps people fight for themselves, and make sense of the healthcare system basically in the US. So it's kind of like this like double realization of like the right priorities, but also like, outside of my family, like how do I want to invest my time basically?
Yeah. And during this like couple of year journey prior to even starting Nurra, you basically stepped out of Thumbtack and you had to build yourself a more flexible career path. So that's when you started the EIR work and started doing advisory and just doing, I guess, what I would call, and what other people have said on the show, like working on having a less greedy career for a period of time. Yeah. That gives you that flexibility. So yeah, it's pretty amazing. I've been very curious about Nurra because I think it could be really helpful for aging people in the US, especially parents like my own parents who have lots of health stuff to navigate. And oftentimes the burden falls on their kids to help them with that. But
Yeah.
I did want to ask you, because you started this company, what, 6 months ago? 6 months ago? Okay. And so 6 months ago, your daughter was 2. So what has starting a company with a 2-year-old been like?
It's been tough because like both of those things are hard by themselves. Right? So like having a 2-year-old is hard, and then starting a company is hard. But I think it's also been one, a necessity and a blessing in a way, because I still need to like help my wife with like many sort of like aspects of our everyday life. I still have to do like most of the childcare and a lot of things in the house. And so I had to find a role that was exciting, that was like financially viable, but that also allowed me to have like a flexible schedule. And that got me excited. I think a lot of what I wanted to think about also is like, what kind of dad, what kind of inspiration do I want to be like for my kids, for my daughter? And I think like starting a company like was sort of like the right sweet spot, because I can, work during the day. I can like leave at 4 to like bring my wife to a doctor's appointment, to go like pick up my daughter, like, ride my bike with her, like do some things. And then like at 8 p.m. I can like go back and actually have like a whole bunch of like meetings on like US time zones until like, 10, 11 p.m. And so, is it like great to like work like both days and like nights? Like, no, but I think it gives you like a flexibility that I think I need right now to support like the rest of my family. And also I think it's a flexibility that I feel like very like grateful for. I think there are like few jobs where you can have like both like this sense of purpose and like this flexibility to accommodate like a lot of the needs that you have in your life.
Yeah. And, assuming that Nurra is successful, which, you can't assume, but I hope it is. When your daughter's a little bit older, you'll have a really cool example to show her. Hey, there's this problem that we were experiencing, and I did something about it in a meaningful way and built this thing. And that'll be a really cool thing to talk to her about, which is, beyond like, I don't know, Bluey or something like that. So I'm curious, dads don't often talk about a lot of the feelings that come along with becoming a father, mostly because I think people don't ask them. And so I am curious to hear about some of the emotions that came up when Noah was born.
Yeah, I think I touched on this like a little bit earlier, but just the depth of responsibility, I think, is what hit me, and like the unconditional of love. It was like, wow, like I love my wife very much, obviously, but this is like a different type of love. It's like, wow, like this is something that like I will fight for like forever. This is just like something that's like just that feels so special, and that I expected yet felt like not ready for. But also like now I'm accountable for like 2 lives, like my own, which was like a little trivial, and this other thing that feels like a tremendous amount of responsibility in a way. It's like the weight of those 2 things I think felt, like overwhelming and amazing in a way. But I think most people experience it, I imagine.
Yeah. And I'm curious, because you just sort of touched on this a little bit. What are some of the more surprising things that you've since discovered as a dad?
Yeah, I think one for me is like this gave me a sense of purpose, and this had like surprising side effects. For example, I used to have this very paralyzing fear of death. I used to have like frequent panic attacks. Like my wife always teasing me for it, but like even like I think at some point when we were in Oakland, I was like, oh my God, I'm having a heart attack now. And like I would like jump in the car and tell my wife like, step on it, let's go.
Oh no.
And like she would drive like, you're fine, like we'll go, don't worry. And like she'd adjust the rearview mirror, and I would be like, are you kidding me? Like step on it. And like I would like almost like jump out the car and then arrive in the hospital, and like, actually I feel fine, it's all good. And but like I used to have like this just paralyzing in like fear of death. And like I've over the years, there are like 3 things that I noticed like have helped me. Like one is like meditation. The other thing, surprisingly, is like astrophysics. I'm like a kind of a space nerd, and like this sort of like a perspective on like your life as a human, like this like sort of speck of dust that you are in the universe. Like for some reason, it's like very soothing to me. It helps you let go of like this sense of like purpose and like this like legacy that you must leave. It's like, no, like, whoever you are, like it doesn't matter much in the end. Like you have just the laws of nature, and that's like all that matters in a way. So it's helped me give me perspective. But the last thing is like being a dad. Like I think my sense of purpose like gets completely contextualized here. It's just, this is why you matter. You matter for this, and like you can let go of this fear. This is what you're in for. So I've not had like a single like sort of panic attack, or like a lot of those fears are completely gone now, which I think it was kind of unexpected.
That's amazing. You heard it here first, folks. having a kid, the cure for panic attacks. Having more kids. Well, that's really great, Ben. And those three things that you said helped you: meditation, astrophysics, which is an interesting one, and then being a dad. So I love all three of those. I would say I know a little less about the astrophysics side, but I do know a bit about meditation and being a dad. So if you were to rewind the clock a few years before Noah was born, and you bumped into younger Ben, what advice would you give to the younger version of yourself about being a dad, or things to know about being a dad?
I think a lot of the advice that I can think of is advice that's like very like short term. Like one piece of advice that I think, and I'm curious to get your take on this when you have like more than one kid, but for me, like when you have like one kid and you're in this like sort of absolutely like horrible phase of like the first like 3 months, you don't sleep, you're like, this will never end. Like this is my life for the next like 20 years now. And it's so hard to get like that perspective. And I think, like hearing and internalizing that like that it gets better, I think is like something that again, like is, a little cliche, but I think I would want to like convey to myself is like, as hard as it may be, like the sleep deprivation, like, all those things, it gets better like much more quickly than you think. And I think that's the perspective. If we think about having a second kid, I feel like my perspective will be like so different because now I have like, I have more perspective on like the time scale that we're in. It's like, oh, like, yeah, the nights are horrible, but like in 3 weeks, it'll be marginally better and all those things. So that's the first one. The second one is like invest in sleep. And this was like related to sleep deprivation. Maybe I have an obsession with this. I should talk to my therapist about it. But I was paranoid about sleep. The one thing that I haven't mentioned is we had a kid and then we decided to move across the world basically with like a 2 months old because we're in the midst of like my wife's health issues and all those things. And so while my wife was 9 months pregnant, like I was packing containers, like, going out to the Pacific Ocean, moving our entire lives, selling our house, like doing all those like sort of crazy things, buying a house remotely, in France that we saw like on the Zoom call. And so like incredibly stressful, like in the middle of those, like having a kid with like a 2 months old basically. And so
in the midst of the pandemic too, was this all happening?
It was after. This was like 2022.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay. Well, it's still bubbling under the surface. Yeah.
But yeah, and so like I was paranoid. I was like, oh my God, like, my life is going to be like particularly miserable because we're like packing all these things. We have like the cat, the dog to figure out. We should make sure that like we should invest in sleep. We should do everything we can to make sure that like we get enough sleep because I hear all those horror stories, like so much tension, with parents, like seems to be attributed to like lack of sleep and all those things. And so I read like 4 books on like, baby sleep, all the different like methodologies, the clinical research, like everything that I could. And everyone has like their own like philosophy for like sleep and what you should do and all those things. But like, and I don't know, I'm sure there's like a big share of like luck, but what we did, like the routine that we created, like all the things that we did, like really paid off for us. Like Noah was sleeping like 12 hours a night, starting at like 3 to 4 months. And we didn't have to resort to like drastic like sleep training, letting her cry like, the whole night or anything like that. But this was the lifeline that we had. It was like, at least we have our nights. And the fact that we were able to like have this like early, I think like saved us. And so doing everything you can to like, maximize, I think your sleep, like for us, like paid off. And I see a lot of friends who like didn't take sleep seriously, whatever that means for you and your principles. And like, I see them like, paying that debt like 2, 3, 4 years, like down the line, basically.
Yeah. Well, one thing I can say about that, Ben, is if you end up having a second kid, don't assume that kid's going to sleep as well as Noah did. Otherwise, you might be in for it.
I'll read more books, Adam.
More books. That's it. That's the key. No, I mean, you mentioned a couple really good things there. One is this idea that getting better. I had a guy named Martin Glover on the podcast recently, and he talked about this concept of this too shall pass, which is like whatever mode you're in, if it's really terrible, if it's really great, like you're going to move past that mode at some point. It's going to change for the better, for the worse. There's ups and there's downs. And so this idea that like, yeah, it does get better. I think especially repeating that mantra to yourself when you're in the moment where you're like, oh my God, what am I doing? I'm so tired or whatever. It gets better. And then the idea of, focusing on sleep and kind of having that routine, it's very helpful. What about advice that you would tell younger Ben to ignore?
I'm telling you, maybe I'm obsessed with like sleep, but the one thing that like used to like that I would find like very irritating is people who's like, oh, enjoy your sleep now. It's going to get horrible. Like, that's just not helpful at all. Like, just don't tell me this. This is not helpful. You're just adding to my stress. It's not funny to me. Give me like helpful advice. Like, how should I, capitalize on this moment that I have now? Should I read more books? Which books should I read?
Yeah, parents love to like make other people anticipate the misery of becoming a parent, but that's not that bad.
It's a form of payback, it feels like.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe like a later realization is, I think when my daughter was born, I had this great sense of purpose, and I felt like I was trying to help my wife and my daughter, and I had like, perhaps like a little bit of like this like sort of savior complex, and I was like, oh my God, this is my purpose. I'm like helping people. I'm, the Jesus of this family. And, I had this like, I think, impression of like what my new role should be in the family. And I think it took me maybe, a little bit of time to realize how important it is not to forget yourself, like both from like a health standpoint, like invest in yourself, like put on your like oxygen mask, like before helping others, like type of thing. And I see a lot of that today, like, how can you expect to regulate the emotions of a 2-year-old if you can't even like regulate your own emotions? Right? So invest in yourself, do what you have to do to like be in that mindset where you can like actually help your child like regulate their emotions. And same thing around like professional development, personal development, like, don't forget. So like don't create an entire identity that's like wrapped up around like your kid, because when a kid is 20, like then you lose completely your identity, right?
Yeah.
And like, what kind of role model do you want to be? You want to be someone who like inspires on like a number of dimensions. Right? And I think it's definitely like for the first year perhaps of like Noah's life, I think I was so wrapped up into like, being this like caretaker that like I completely lost myself. And I think I lost perspective on what I think it means to be a great dad from that lens.
Wow. That is really great advice. Thank you. I haven't had a 2.5-year-old in a very long time. So I'm curious, what are the 2.5-year-olds reading these days? Or rather, what are you reading to her? What's your favorite book to read to your daughter?
We're big fans of Bluey. And so like we read a lot of Bluey. Right now, we're also a big fan of Cluck. It's a book about like chickens that like, count the hours. So now I was like learning how to count. And so like this is we read this like 3 to 4 times a day. Yeah.
Have you memorized it yet?
Yes. I feel like this is like an accomplishment. Like when you can like turn the page, not look, and like read the entire book, you feel a moment of like, some pride.
I could do that with several of my kids' books. The longer, the better, which is amazing. Then your just mind wanders as your mouth is still moving. So, okay, Bluey and Cluck O'Clock. We will link to those two. I'm going to have to check this out. Sounds like a real page turner. I want to talk a little bit about the French, not versus US, but just the different parenting philosophies, because I'm always very curious about this when I talk to folks. And especially it's interesting for you because you've had this perspective of kind of being in both places, and like, you had a young daughter there and then now, in France. And so I had this guy named Ty DeGrange on the show, and he talked about all of these books that he had read on the French parenting philosophy. I think his favorite one was called Bringing Up Bébé. And so as you, an actual living, breathing French person who has lived in both places, how would you describe the differences in parenting between the US and France?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the book, first of all, as well. Not everything in that book is true. I think it romanticizes a little bit. It's like the Emily in Paris of like French parenting.
Yeah. Well, I read that it was written by a US journalist.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, that's interesting.
There's that. But I think like there is some truth to it in terms of like the fundamental like differences in perspectives. My view of it, and I'm going to stereotype here perhaps a little bit, but we've taken certain like bits of like both parenting styles. So like in France, there is really this thinking, I think in general, again, it's generalization, but that the baby should fit within the constraints of the family. And so the family has like a routine, has a certain like set of rules. And the baby just becomes like a part of the family and like should abide by like those rules and should be like considered as, a member of the family, but again, like just an extension of it. Whereas I think in the US, sometimes like the family like reorients itself and its rules to cater to like to the child basically. And so you have this concept that I think is like a key sort of concept that's talked about in the book, is le cadre, which is like the framework, essentially the frame. And this is like a big part of French parenting is you have this like hard set of boundaries. So you're like really strict on those, like have like real like natural consequences. And within this like frame, then you can give like sort of full permission to your child, basically. And I think this is like a really powerful concept. It's like, those are the rules of the house. Like everything else is like fair game, but like those are like non-negotiable, basically. And we're really firm with those. And I think that's like one concept I think really like resonates, at least like to us personally. I think French parents also in general are also really attached to not losing sight of like their own like identity as people, and not, again, like wrapping up their entire identity around like parenting, basically. And so there's like this strong desire for individuality, for like quickly like resuming your like normal activities as an adult, like after having a kid. And so like that's a big part of like the French culture. And I can sort of like relate to like this other piece I think that I've observed with like sort of American culture is like sometimes, American parents like will outcompete each other for like how much like suffering they're willing to go through. Like, oh yeah, well, I wake up at 5 a.m. to bring my kids like 3 hours. Oh yeah, well, I go to like the top chess class, And France is a little bit of like the opposite, where it's like, oh, like my kid, like I just let them like play in the backyard. I'd lock the door for 3 hours and I drink rosé with my friends, But there's a little bit of like this pride in like, I'm maintaining my identity. Whereas I think in the US, there's a little bit of this pride for like, here's like how much of a sacrifice I'm willing to like make for my kid, basically.
Yeah. And it's not necessarily that one or the other of those is like the right way to do it. But I do find that maybe something that kind of incorporates both of those feels like a nice middle ground, which is like, don't lose too much of your own identity, but also don't lock your kid in the backyard and drink rosé for 3 or 4 hours. I mean, unless your backyard's amazing, which it might be in France. So you mentioned that French concept where you're kind of really strict on certain guardrails and boundaries. And then within that, kids have unlimited autonomy. What's like an example of like a ground rule or like a strictness that they either talk about in the book or like a French parent might, impose?
Meal times are a big one. Like dinner, like in France, is like a lot more like religious, I think, than like in the US. It's like this moment of like communion where like everyone gets together. There's like typically time. It's, like 8 p.m. Like you're at the table with everyone. Whereas I think my first experience in the US, I had a pen pal in Racine, Wisconsin. And like, this was like a bit of a cultural shock because I was 16 at the time. And I was like, oh, like we're going to do like a great dinner, like all together. And it was like kind of like it felt like a picnic to me. Like everyone like just grab a slice of bread, like, bite like a piece of salad and an apple. And I was like, that's dinner. Like, this felt like a sacrilegious. I think for me, when I like dinner was like just this thing where like, everyone sits down. And so this is an example where I think a lot of parents are real strict. You have to be home. You have to be like at the table. You have to be like bathed, for example, depending on the age, like at 8 p.m. And that's when like, that's the time we have together. And if you're not there, then like you just don't eat, basically. And so you have those hard rules. Like after that, before that, you can just go play with friends. You can do whatever you want. But like at 8, you're sitting at the table, you're ready to eat, you're clean and all those things. So that's I think a pretty key moment.
And at 9 o'clock, the door locks and they have to spend the night outside.
Exactly.
I do like that about mealtime, though. This idea that's kind of like a sacred, you have so much other stuff going on during the day. That's nice to have that as like a sacred time. And I would agree, for many people in the US, it's not really all that sacred anymore. So, okay, I wanted to ask you about management and kids. And so you were a manager before your daughter was born. You were a VP. You managed people. You were a leader at Thumbtack. And I'm curious, now you're a startup founder. Would you say that there are any parallels between becoming a dad and your management style? Like, how would you compare, or what have you learned from one of those things to kind of influence the other?
I think there's definitely like a lot of parallels. And even like, I think parenting management, but even like, I think like couple communication, it feels like there's a lot of things where, I'll read like a parenting book and like try to apply something to like Noah. And then I was like, actually, that would also apply nicely to like to my wife or like to my direct report, right? And like a lot of things around, I think that the basics of communication, I feel like working with a toddler, you're working with like the building blocks of communications. I think you have to be very deliberate in like the way you validate their emotion, the way you like, hear them, the way you make space for things, the way you realize that, like how capable they are of this particular thing that you're asking of them in that particular moment because of the context. So I think you're forced to recognize like, the constraints, the communication constraints that you have. And when you have an adult in front of you, I think like those constraints are like abstracted. You have this much more like elaborate and complex sort of mode of communication. But I feel like talking with a toddler like forces you to like be more mindful of those like, building blocks of communication and realize how, perhaps you have a spouse that is going through like a tough moment because of something at work or something like that. And it's realizing like, oh, wow, like what this person needs right now is emotional like validation. And I think it's something that you don't really do when you're like talking from like adult to adult, because you're never forced to like be that mindful, because the other adult will like, compensate for your lack of, like empathy or whatever it is, when a child will not and will scream until you figure it out. But I feel like this is maybe just my impression, but I feel like it's made me a better like listener and communicator, because I'm able to like, hone in like those like building blocks, and I've had to like go back to the basics, I guess, of communication because of this.
Yeah. And I think you also maybe mentioned performance reviews not as effective with a 2-year-old.
Yes. Still working on that, but yeah.
Oh, I love that. Speaking of performance reviews, and speaking of what you just mentioned, that partnership's really important when you have kids, but also I think it's impossible to agree 100% of the time with your spouse. And so I'm curious, where's an area where you and Gael don't necessarily agree or have the same philosophy?
I have to say, I feel incredibly fortunate, because I actually think that we're aligned like 99.9% of the time. So like what we disagree on is like nuances of how you apply like a certain like parenting philosophy. And so I felt very lucky in that sense. I can imagine like how tough it must be to have like different philosophies, which is totally okay. But it's like, must be tough to like find a middle ground like all the time. Yeah. So I think for us, it's like perhaps a more like, I tend to believe more firmly on like natural consequences like than my wife. And so like if Noah doesn't want to get dressed, that like I'll walk out like, okay, well, I'm going to like daycare, and so I'll leave the house, and like she'll chase me like butt naked, in the front yard. I believe this is when my wife, I think, will, try to lean more on like, I don't know, perhaps like being more empathetic in a different way or something like that. So it's like a nuance, I think, but yeah.
Yeah. I think I'm in the Ben philosophy there. The number of times that my son went to daycare in his pajamas from the night before, a lot of times, let's just say. He loved those pajamas. And you know what? He wears clothes now. Turns out it was fine. It was all fine. But that's great. So, you built an entire career in technology for, well over a decade, almost 2 decades now. When you think about the relationship that you want Noah to have with technology as she gets older, what is that relationship?
I think technology is obviously a big piece of my life. Building an AI company, I have like a server rack in my garage, like to manage like my home automation with like 2,000 like services running. So I think it is like a big part of my life, and I think it's a big part of the future, I think. And so I want my kids, my daughter, to like be comfortable with technology. I want her to like see the beauty of it. I love tinkering, and so I love the idea of like like exposing her to like some of the tinkering that I do, and like the magic that technology can bring, I think sometimes. But I'm also like a big fan of like the outdoors. I grew up again, like, spending a lot of time outdoors in the countryside. I lived in Tahoe. I live in the French Alps right now. I love going like backcountry skiing. I love like a lot of this. And so my hope is that I will love her no matter what, first of all, obviously. Mm-hmm. But my hope is that she can find, I think, the beauty in like both, is that like she can like, find this like sort of genuine sort of passion for like the beauty of the outdoors, and like finding this as kind of like a quiet place that recharges you, and connect this to like, the power of technology, I guess, in a way.
Yeah. Well, I love that. I love that. It is also going to be amazing to see what, she's only 2.5. It'd be amazing to see what technology enables by the time that she's 5 or 10 or something like that. So
AI skiing.
Very curious. Yes.
Whatever that means.
Now that you're a dad, what are some of the ways that you recharge your batteries or center yourself?
Listening to this podcast, of course. That's my go-to.
I mean, that's what everyone says.
What's the name of the podcast again? I'm just kidding.
It's called Tech Dad. I have a friend who says that it's called Tech Dad because she can never remember.
Okay. I love mountain biking. I'm a big mountain biker. So mountain biking, snowboarding. I'm also a big rock climber. So like a lot of those sports. I don't have like time for a lot of those, but like whenever I can, also like, I'll go biking, in the woods nearby, or, go snowboarding in the mountains when there's fresh snow. So that's my happy place. This is what, recharges me for weeks after. So
yeah. I wanted to actually come back. I want to deviate for a second and come back to the server rack and the home automations. Give me a glimpse into the automations that exist in your household. What's one you're most proud of?
My wife loses her phone all the time, and it drives me nuts. She's like, have you seen my phone? And I never know where her phone is. And we are constantly late because she forgets her phone. And so now I have an automation where like there's a big button in the kitchen and like she just has to press the button. And it basically like, I asked ChatGPT to like come up with like a roast, like sort of sentence of what her phone like might say. It's like, oh, you've lost me again. It's like, oh, you must love hide and seek for always like, hiding in the house. Or remember the last time we spent the day together? Me neither. And so the phone like randomly say this like in the house. And my wife hates it, but it's also like so useful that she's like, ah. And so this has been like a pretty fun one too.
So the phone, in its attempt to help you locate it, will say a snarky comment generated by ChatGPT.
I basically like max out the volume and like it'll read out loud, like real loudly, like this like random sentence basically. Yeah.
This is amazing. I absolutely love this home automation. Okay. Now, on a more serious note, I'm curious, what is a mistake that you've made as a dad?
I think one that like I'm still making today is just like the expectations that you have for a 2-year-old. Like I think sometimes we're like, oh my God, why can't you get dressed? I just told you like 17 times, like, well, it's a 2-year-old, she has big feelings and that's just how things are at this age. Yeah. I think it's like, it's so easy to like lose perspective. And so I think too high expectations, not setting up my child for success, I think is one that unfortunately I make constantly and I am trying to be better at. The other one that I talked about is just like no outlet for my own emotions. I think, like just realizing that forcing myself to be more mindful of like where I'm at. And my wife and I have this great system. I think a few parents like have this as well, but like we can like, we can tap out. So either of us can like tap out. So you're like, okay, look, I'm really sorry. Like I realize that I'm no longer able to do like effective parenting and I just need help. Or the other parent can actually like chime in and like just tap on their shoulder and be like, hey, trust me, I think you need like some space for yourself right now. Like I got this. And so I think it's been really helpful thanks to my wife. But, a mistake that I've made is just like not realizing like this, I think, and being caught up in my own emotions, being too deep and not realizing that I need to find space to, again, like take care of myself to be able to take care of my daughter.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Last couple questions for you. So you worked at some pretty intense startups, Lyft. Obviously, we were moving 1,000,000 miles an hour. Thumbtack, I'm sure. Now you're starting a company. How do you relate to the startup hustle culture mentality or the founder mode or things like that? How do you balance that, or what's your kind of approach there?
I think it's a balance. I think fondly of those days when we're working together. Like this is still like, just it's the mode that I enjoy most. It's like the almost like all consuming like mode, like raw building. This is when like you make magic happen. It feels like this is when like one person is worth like 1,000 and like just the true magic happens. And so I get incredibly energized by this. I also see like how incredible things can be built when you're in this mode. But I also, like I said earlier, I think I'm putting this in context of what is the capacity that I want to dedicate to this. And so it's basically I look at like, the pie chart of my life and my, my time, my attention. And it's like, well, I got to fill that up with like, keeping my wife healthy and keeping my daughter so like fulfilled. And then whatever is left, I will dedicate it fully to like, like this obsession for like the mission that we have at Nurra and all those things. But I will try to enforce like hard boundaries for the rest of my life. So it's been a little bit odd to like switch back between like this like all consuming thing and like, phew, you power off and you're like, oh, well, now I'm like doodling things and I have to force myself to like just not think about like all the crazy things that are like happening like right now. But I feel like I'm slowly able to like blend the two. And so, yeah, to mix.
All right. Well, my final question for you before our lightning round, how can people be most helpful to you right now in your journey?
Anyone who disagrees with anything that I've said has like sort of coaching advice or parenting advice based on anything that I've said, like I'll take it. So let me know. Always happy to learn from my mistakes. And then, yeah, anyone who's navigating sort of like complex health challenges, complex conditions and needs help sort of navigating the health journey, would love to help with Nurra. We're early, but yeah, we're basically like the, you're the best friend nurse that's helping you hack the healthcare system is how we describe it. So
awesome. And the product is live, right? Beta testing, or it's People
It's
can
live.
use it, right? It's live. Awesome.
Live.
Well, Ben, I will link to Nurra so everyone can check it out. I am also curious to check it out myself. So cannot wait. So, all right. Rules of lightning round. I ask you a question and you say the first thing that comes to mind, and then we move on. It's a very judgment-free zone. Maybe a modicum of judgment.
Can I say a few words for why my answer?
Okay. You are totally allowed. Actually, the reality is there are no real rules here for lightning round, so it's totally up to you. Okay, the first question. What is the most indispensable parenting product that you have ever purchased?
Ooh, we love our Nanit baby cam. Amazing.
Okay. What is the most useless parenting product you've ever purchased?
The same friend who recommended Nanit was like, oh, you gotta get the Kikaru peanut changing station. It's amazing. It's so easy to clean. This is like a $150 changing mat. And we were like, that's okay. We bought a $18 one on Amazon when we moved to France, and that's literally the same. So do not pay $150 for a changing mat.
No. Okay. What is the youngest age that you can feed a kid a baguette?
Straight they're born. They actually roll them in bread crusts, bread crumbs at the hospital.
They give it to them at the hospital to use as a pacifier when you're in France. Yeah, is that right?
Exactly.
Okay. The ideal day with your daughter involves which one activity?
I'll have to say, biking. I'm a big mountain biker, and so I love going biking with my daughter. She's now the age where she can follow me on little trails, which is really cool. And then 2, building blanket forts with her.
Oh,
it's
love
a favorite
that.
of mine.
What is the most frustrating thing that has ever happened to you as a dad?
We were traveling back to the US because we had some paperwork to do, and we were boarding a plane, and Noah just pooped herself everywhere, and I was carrying her, and I just had poop everywhere. Boarding a plane, sleep deprived for 18 hours is I cannot do this. I almost just put her on the seat and walked out, Luckily, I got my shit together, but yeah.
That sounds like the thing of nightmare fuel. Okay, what is your go-to dad wardrobe?
Mostly Lyft swag. I'm surprised I'm not wearing a Lyft t-shirt, but I have a lot of Lyft and hoodies, and
I have an entire box of the generations of Lyft swag. It's in a closet somewhere, but it doesn't come out very much. Someday it might be worth something. We'll see. How many parenting books do you have in your house?
We probably have including the Kindle versions, I don't know, maybe 20.
Okay. And how many have you read cover to cover?
Probably 12, 15. I mentioned 5 on Sleep Alone. So
Yeah. I'm impressed. This is a large number of books relative to the average dad. So congratulations. What has been the favorite age for your daughter so far?
14 years old. It's cannot wait.
You'll see it in 7 years.
Yeah. No, I think right now is really amazing. You get to actually build things that are engaging in 2 ways. And
What is the least favorite age?
Sub 6 months, I feel is just hard.
Have you started telling dad jokes yet? And if so, how many do you tell on average in a given day?
I've never stopped. I think I'm, never reached quite the mastery level that you're at. But yeah, I think I was born to be a dad to the despair of my wife, I think, to be clear. Yeah.
Oh, it's always to the despair of your significant other. That's the job. I don't know if your daughter watches a whole lot of TV, but what is the most difficult TV show that you have had to sit through?
She doesn't watch a lot of TV. We just started Bluey because it's 5 minutes, but we tried a few things. We tried, answer a side question. We tried a few Disney's. I was oh, that's going to be great. But all the Disney's are horrible. Nemo, the third minute of the movie, the mom dies.
Yeah.
Half of the Disney's, one of the parents dies in the first 5 minutes of the movie.
Yes.
This is absolutely insane.
Not good. Not good. Do you have a favorite kids movie?
No, I said, it's a lot of Bluey right now.
Yeah, a lot of Bluey. Okay.
But I love Bluey. I think Bluey is great because for those who don't know Bluey, I think it's amazing. It's, as a parent, it's also really good. And there's a lot of tongue-in-cheek sort of references for the parents that make it really enjoyable to watch.
My kids were kind of too old when Bluey became popular, but I got to find a way to work into the Bluey world. We'll see. Maybe with my niece. We'll see. How long can a piece of food sit on the floor and you will still eat it?
Well, let's see. The Roomba runs twice a week, so it'd be on average 3 days.
Love that. Do you have a favorite nostalgic movie that you cannot wait to force Noah to watch?
Yes, Harry Potter.
Oh,
My wife and I are like big Harry Potter fans. Like we watch it religiously, like twice a year at least. And so
love that.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, finally, probably not super relevant because you live in the mountains of France, but what is your take on minivans?
If I may, I will expand the question a little bit. I'm a huge fan of RVs.
Okay.
And this is like, we rented like RVs a couple times with my wife. This was like our honeymoon. We went to like Alaska, and huge fan of RVs. And I actually think that the RV industry will be completely disrupted by self-driving cars. Like this is my dream. Like imagine like you get with your kids in an RV and you press like Disneyland, Los Angeles. And like then you turn around, you play games, you shower, you go and sleep. Like it doesn't matter how long it takes. Like you just get to play games. I feel like the world will be a different place.
Wow, man, that's amazing. The future, Ben, the future. So not big on minivans, but RVs, which are like a minivan on steroids, we're okay with. All right. Well, Ben, this concludes the Startup Dad podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. So great to chat with you.
Thank you so much, Adam. It's so great.
Thank you for listening to today's conversation with Ben Lauzier. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, share, and leave me a review on Apple or Spotify. It'll help other people find this podcast. Startup Dad is a Fishman AF production with editing support from Tommy Heron. You can join a community of over 11,000 subscribers and stay up to date on my thoughts on growth, product, and parenting by subscribing to the Fishman AF newsletter at www.fishmanafnewsletter.com. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.